Good evening. Today is Thursday, the 25th of February, the 40th anniversary of the publication of a novel which shook the world of literature. Not just the world of literature here in Scotland, but all over the earth, perhaps out into the solar system, even out into the further corners of the cosmos. And if a multiverse exists, there are surely an infinite number of Lanarks, each written by an infinite number of Alasdair Grays, all being celebrated on an infinite number of todays. This broadcast is to introduce the world to the concept of Grey Day, a reading of the 4 books of Lanark. This inaugural Grey Day broadcast will feature a selection of those infinite minds, 16 of them. The books are read in the order they were published. There will be a prologue, interlude, and epilogue. Please buy the book afterwards in the foyer. Over to Francis Bickmore of Canongate Books.
Hi there, I'm Francis Bickmore and I'm Publishing Director of Canongate Books, and we feel extremely proud to have been Alasdair's publisher for 40 years as of today, Grey Day. This marks the 40th anniversary of the first publication of this wonderful tome. And it was a transformative book for Canongate. It was the first major book Canongate had published in its incarnation in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was the book that really got international attention and acclaim for this little Scottish indie. It's lasted as a book that has changed what is possible in fiction. It broke more or less every rule. It broke more or less every deadline. The book was about 30 years in its gestation from the first passages Alasdair published in the early 50s through to its publication. And as I say, it broke every genre rule. It manages to be speculative fiction, science fiction, realist novel, memoir, and a book in 4 books that begins with book 3, which just captures the perverse brilliance of this mind of the one and only Alasdair Gray.
The Elite Cafe was entered by a staircase from the foyer of a cinema. A landing 2/3 of the way up had a door into the cinema itself, but people going to the Elite climbed farther and came to a large dingy-looking room full of chairs and low coffee tables. The room seemed dingy, not because it was unclean, but because of the lighting. A crimson carpet covered the floor, the chairs were upholstered in scarlet, the low ceiling was patterned with whorled pink plaster, but dim green wall lights turned these colours into varieties of brown and made the skins of the customers look greyish and dead. The entrance was in a corner of the room, and the opposite corner held a curved chromium and plastic counter where a bald, fat, smiling man stood behind the glittering handles of a coffee machine. He wore black trousers, white shirt and black bow tie, and was either dumb or unusually reticent. He never spoke. The customers only addressed him to order coffee or cigarettes, and when not serving these, he stood so still that the counter seemed an extension of him, like the ring round Saturn. A door by the bar opened onto a narrow outdoor balcony above the cinema entrance. This had room for 3 crowded-together metal-topped tables with parasols through the middle. Coffee was not drunk here because the sky was often dark with strong wind and frequent rain. The tabletops had little puddles on them. The collapsed cloth of the parasols flapped soddenly against the poles. The seats were dank. Yet a man of about 24 usually sat here, huddled in a black raincoat with the collar turned up. Sometimes he gazed in a puzzled way at the black sky. Sometimes he bit thoughtfully on the knuckle of his thumb. Nobody else used the balcony.
When the Elite was full, most languages and dialects could be heard there. The customers were under 30 and sat in cliques of 5 or 6. There were political cliques, religious cliques, homosexual cliques, and criminal cliques. Some cliques talked about athletics, others about motor cars, others about jazz. Some cliques were centred on particular people, the biggest being dominated by Sludden. His clique usually occupied a sofa by the balcony door. An adjacent clique contained people who had belonged to Sludden's clique, but grown tired of it, as they claimed, or been expelled from it, as Sludden claimed. The cliques disliked each other, and none liked the cafe much. It was common for a customer to put down his coffee cup and say, "The Elite is a hellish place. I don't know why we come here. The coffee's bad, the lighting's bad, the whole dump teems with poofs and wogs and Jews. Let's start a fashion for going somewhere else." And someone would answer, "There is nowhere else. Galloway's tea room is too bourgeois, all businessmen and umbrella stands and stuffed stags' heads. The Shangri-La has a jukebox that half deafens you, and anyway, it's full of hard men. Armstrong had his face slashed there." There are pubs, of course, but we can't always be drinking. Nope, this may be a hellish place, but it's all we have. It's central, it's handy for the cinema, and at least it's a change from home.
The cafe was often crowded and never completely empty, but on one occasion it nearly emptied. The man in the black raincoat came in from the balcony and saw nobody but the waiter and Sludden, who sat on his usual sofa. The man hung his coat on a hook and ordered a coffee. When he left the counter, he saw Sludden watching him with amusement. Sludden said, "Did you find it, Lanark?" "Find what? What do you mean?" "Find what you were looking for on the balcony. Or do you go there to avoid us? I'd like to know. You interest me." "How do you know my name?" "Oh, we all know your name. One of us is usually in the queue when they shout it at the security place. Sit down." Sludden patted the sofa beside him. Lanark hesitated, then put his cup on the table and sat. Sludden said, "Tell me why you used the balcony." "I'm looking for daylight." Sludden pursed his mouth as if tasting sourness. "This is hardly a season for daylight." "You're wrong. I saw some not long ago, and it lasted while I counted over 400, and it used to last longer. Do you mind my talking about this?" "Go on. You couldn't discuss it with many people, but I've thought things out. Now you are trying to think things out, and that interests me. Say what you like."
Lanark was pleased and annoyed. He was lonely enough to feel flattered when people spoke to him, but he disliked condescension. He said coldly, "There's not much to say." "But why do you like daylight? We're well lit by the usual means. I can measure time with it. I've counted 30 days since coming here. Maybe I've missed a few by sleeping or drinking coffee, but when I remember something, I can say it happened 2 days ago, or 10 or 20. This gives my life a feeling of order." "And how do you spend your days?" "I walk and visit libraries and cinemas. When short of money, I go to the security place, but most of the time, I watch the sky from the balcony." "And are you happy?" "No, but I'm content. There are nastier ways of living." Sludden laughed. "No wonder you've a morbid obsession with daylight. Instead of visiting 10 parties since you came here, laying 10 women and getting drunk 10 times, you've watched 30 days go by. Instead of making life a continual feast, you chop it into days and swallow them regularly, like pills." Lanark looked sideways at Sludden. "Is your life a continual feast?" "I enjoy myself. Do you?" "No, but I'm content." "Why are you content with so little?" "What else can I have?"
by the date, was a version I started writing in 1959 in the house where I was born. And Lanark by Robert Walker. At that time I decided that I was going to publish it under a pseudonym so that I could travel anonymously without anybody knowing that I was the famous author of this famous novel.
When somebody asks you to describe your book Lanark, what do you say to them?
I say it is a Scottish petty bourgeois model of the universe.
Just like that?
Yes, I've rehearsed it and honed it down to as few words as possible.
Chapter 12. The war begins. Duncan Thaw drew a blue line along the top of a sheet of paper and a brown line along the bottom. He drew a giant with a captured princess running along the brown line, and since he couldn't draw the princess lovely enough, he showed the giant holding a sack. The princess was in the sack. His father looked over his shoulder and said, "What's that you're drawing?" Thaw said uneasily, "A miller running to the mill with a bag of corn." "What's the blue line supposed to be? The sky?" "Do you mean the horizon?" Thaw stared dumbly at his picture. "The horizon is the line where the sky and land seem to touch. Is it the horizon?" "It's the sky." "But the sky isn't a straight line, Duncan." "Would be if you saw it sideways." Mr. Thaw got a golf ball and a table lamp and explained that the earth was like the ball and the sun like the lamp. Thaw was bored and puzzled. He said, "Do people fall off the sides?" "No, they're kept on by gravity." "What's gravity?" "Gravity is what keeps us on the earth. Without it, we would fly up into the air. And then we would reach the sky." No, the sky is just the space above our heads. Without gravity, we would fly up into it forever. But wouldn't we come to a thing on the other side? There is no other side, Duncan. None at all.
Thaw leaned over his drawing and drew a blue crayon along the line of the sky, pressing hard. He dreamed that night of flying up through empty air till he reached a flat blue cardboard sky. He rested against it like a balloon against a ceiling until worried by the thought of what was on the other side. Then he broke a hole and rose through more empty air till he grew afraid of floating forever. Then he came to another cardboard sky and rested there till worried by the thought of the other side, and so on. Thaw lived in the middle story of a corporation tenement that was red sandstone in front and brick behind. The tenement backs enclosed a grassy area divided into greens by spiked railings, and each green had a midden. Gangs of midden rakers from Black Hill crossed the canal to steal from the middens. He was told that Black Hill people were Catholics, with beasts in their hair. One day, two men came to the back greens with a machine that squirted blue flame and clouds of sparks. They cut the spikes from the railings with the flame, put them in a bag, and took them away to use in the war.
Mrs. Gilchrist downstairs said angrily, "Now even the youngest of these Black Hill kids will be able to rake our middens. Other workmen build air raid shelters in the back greens and a very big one in the school playground, and if Thaw heard the air raid warning on the way to school, he must run to the nearest shelter. Going up to school by the steep back lane, one morning he heard the siren wailing in the blue sky. He was almost at school but turned and ran home to where his mother waited in the back green shelter with the neighbours. At night, dark green blinds were pulled down over the windows. Then Mr. Thaw put on an armband and steel hat and went into the street to search for houses showing illegal chinks of light. Someone told Mrs. Thor that the former tenants of her flat had killed themselves by putting their heads in the oven and turning the gas on. She wrote at once to the corporation asking that her gas cooker be changed for an electric one, but as Mr. Thor would still need food when he returned from work, she baked him a shepherd's pie, but with her lips more tightly pursed than usual.
Her son always refused shepherd's pie or any other food whose appearance disgusted him. Spongy white tripe, soft penis-like sausages, stuffed sheep's heart, with their valves and little arteries. When one of these came before him, he poked it uncertainly with his fork and said, "I don't want it." "Why not? It looks queer." "But you haven't tasted it. Taste just a wee bit, for my sake." "No. Children in China are starving for food like that. We'll send it to them." After more discussion, his mother would say in a high-pitched voice, "You'll sit at this table till you eat every bit, or just you wait till I tell your father about this, my dear." Then he would put a piece of food in his mouth, gulp without tasting, and vomit it back onto the plate. After that, he would be shut in the back bedroom. Sometimes his mother came to the door and said, "Will you not eat just a wee bit of it, for my sake?" And then Thor, feeling cruel, shouted "No," and went to the window and looked down into the back green. He would see friends playing there, or the midden rakers, or neighbours hanging out washing, and feel so lonely and magnificent that he considered opening the window and jumping out. It was a bitter glee to imagine his corpse thudding to the ground among them.
Mr. Gray, I have heard people call you a piss artist, one who, by hard drinking, converts the profits of his artistry into piss. That's partly true, but my use and abuse of alcohol has not yet stopped me working hard and well. That may be an alcoholic delusion. Posterity will judge. Let us discuss your personality, Mr. Gray, your manner of appearing to people. In this little book, you describe yourself as, in conversation, animated and friendly, perhaps too friendly. I usually have the overeager manner of one who fears to be disliked. Why do you fear to be disliked? Because I'm afraid of fights, afraid of being hurt. As a schoolboy, once or twice, I was mocked and insulted by tougher boys who knew I wouldn't hit back. You were a coward? Oh, yes. And I found it quite handy, if I met them accidentally afterwards at a bus stop, to talk to them quite cheerfully as if nothing painful had passed between us. And they were usually so taken aback that there wasn't anything painful after that. So your friendly, open manner is a way of manipulating people? Oh, I don't deny it. So you're a control freak. Your friend, the poet Tom Leonard, once said that working with Alasdair Gray was like a sandcastle working with the sea. I am certainly the kind of artist who wants to control, as much as I can, the appearance of the work I do in writing and in painting and how it's produced.
The front bedroom was dusty, the curtains unclean. Books and papers overlapped the tortoise-shell combs and pin trays on the dressing table. On the wall near the bed, a black-bordered photograph of the late king was stuck beside the only picture by Thor his mother much liked, a childish one of a tree shedding leaves in an autumn gale. These remained because their presence brought Mrs. Thor less to mind than their removal would have done. On the first day of art school, he woke to the sweet rotten odour which had come when the corpse lay coffined on the hearth rug. It had taken 2 or 3 weeks to vanish, and he still sometimes found it on entering the room unexpectedly, although he knew by now it must be altogether ghostly and subjective. Through a gap in the curtains he saw a slice of colourless sky with dark rags of cloud moving across like the shadows of smoke.
The 10 to 8 factory horns mourned over the city roofs, and he curled more tightly into the nest of warmth his body made in the mattress. For like all bad sleepers, he enjoyed bed most in the minutes before leaving it. Faint sounds came from the kitchen where his father prepared breakfast. Hundreds of thousands of men in dirty coats and heavy boots were tramping along grey streets to the gates of forges and machine shops. He thought with awe of the energy needed to keep up a civilization, of the implacable routines which started drawing it from the factory workers daily at 8, from the clerk and shopkeeper at 9. Why didn't everyone decide to stay in bed one morning? It would mean the end of civilization. But in spite of 2 world wars, the end of civilization was still an idea, while bed was a warm and immediate fact.
He heard his father approach the door and shut his eyes. Mr. Thor entered quietly, pulled back the curtains, came to the bed and laid a hand on Thor's brow. Thor smiled and opened his eyes. His father smiled and said, "Were you really asleep?" "Not really." Over breakfast, they talked about money. "How much will you need for materials?" "I don't know. I don't yet know what materials I'll need, but I can get them on account at the school shop." "That's a very bad idea. It's too easy. I can see you buying something, losing it, and buying another," Thor said stiffly. "Have you reasons for doubting my honesty?" "I don't doubt your honesty, but I distrust your memory. If you get goods on account, be sure to keep the invoices as a reminder." "How much will you need for the midday meal?" 2 shillings. 10 bob a week for food. Your tram fares won't come to more than 5 shillings, so here's £1. That's too much. Regard the extra as pocket money. No doubt you'll want coffee with a friend sometime. Thor had hoped for more pocket money. He said in no particular tone of voice, "Thanks very much." And Duncan, 5 shillings a week isn't much pocket money for a boy who'll soon be 18. If you ever want to take a lassie out, let me know, and I'll give you more.
Garnet Hill was one of several whale-shaped hills lying parallel to the Clyde, and the school was on a quiet street along the spine of it. The main part was an elegant building designed by Mackintosh in the 1880s, but Thor entered the annex across the road, a terrace of old houses with new additions among them. He walked down a twisting corridor with so many unexpected descents that it seemed underground. The studio at the end was filled with clear, grey morning light from windows in the girder-supported roof. Among tall easels, plaster statues, and draught screens, some girls crowded loosely in a space like a forest clearing, and boys sat on stools, talking nonchalantly in couples. Some smoked, and Thor envied them, for a cigarette would have employed his hands. He could have opened a book and sat behind something reading it, but he was tired of being thought a bookish hermit and meant to forge a new, confident, sardonic, mysterious character for himself. So, frowning and leaning against the wall, he pretended to see nobody, though glancing furtively at one of the girls.
Your friendships seem to have profited you. 2 studies of your work have been printed in Britain, one by the Scottish Academic Press, and this book here, published by the British Library. Most of the contributors are Scottish and friends of yours. Even 2 who aren't close friends and aren't Scottish, Will Self and Jonathan Coe, write about you with enthusiastic approval. Why does so little impersonal criticism of you come out of England? Perhaps because I don't live there. But most English book reviewers have been kind to my books. Not all of them. Speaking about 1982, Janine, Peter Levi says, I recommend nobody to read this book. It is sexually oppressive, the sentences are far too long, and it is boring hogwash. Radioactive hogwash. American reviewers and French and other European reviewers have generally been kinder.
Chapter 31. Nan. Lanark opened his eyes and looked thoughtfully round the ward. The window was covered again by the Venetian blind, and a bed in one corner was hidden by screens. Rima sat beside him, eating figs from a brown paper bag. He said, "That was very unsatisfying. I can respect a man who commits suicide after killing someone. It's clearly the right thing to do. But not a man who drowns himself for a fantasy. Why did the Oracle not make clear which of these happened?" Rima said, "What are you talking about?" "The Oracle's account of my life before Unthank. He's just finished it." Rima said firmly, "In the first place, that Oracle was a woman, not a man. In the second place, her story was about me. You were so bored that you fell asleep and obviously dreamed something else." He opened his mouth to argue, but she popped a fig in, saying, "It's a pity you didn't stay awake, because she told me a lot about you. You were a funny, embarrassing, not very sexy boy who kept chasing me when I was 19. I had the sense to marry someone else." "And you," cried Lanark, angrily swallowing, "were a frigid, cock-teasing virgin who kept shoving me off with one hand and dragging me back with the other. I killed someone because I couldn't get you." "We must have been listening to different oracles. I'm sure you imagined all that. Is there anything else to eat?" "No, we used it all up."
With a clattering of purposeful feet, a stretcher was pushed into the ward among a crowd of doctors and nurses. Monroe marched in front. Technicians followed, dragging cylinders and apparatus. They went behind the screens in the corner, and nothing could be heard but low hissing and some phrases which seemed to have drifted from the corridors. The conceived conceiving in mid-conception. Inglorious Milton, guiltless Cromwell. Why inglorious? Why not guilty? She came naked, that helped. Monroe came over and stood at the bed's foot, regarding them gravely. He said, "I've arranged a meeting with Lord Monboddo 3 hours from now to authorise your departure from the Institute. I had meant you to wait here till then, but we've had an unexpected delivery of human beings. They're in good condition, but feeble, and will die if someone puts them off their food. A nurse is bringing in your clothes. You can dress and wait in the staff club." "No need," said Lanark. "We wouldn't spread our opinions in a case like this." Monroe asked Rima, "Do you agree?" "Of course, but I'd like to see your staff club." "If I can trust you, I'd like you to stay here. This is a lonely ward, and company would help the woman feel at home." Rima said brightly, I'd be delighted to help you, Dr. Munro, but will you do something for us? Get Monsignor Noakes to send more of his lovely food. It will be easy to not mention food when we have some. Munro walked away, saying grimly, I promise nothing, but I'll do what I can. Lanark stared at her and said, You are unscrupulous. She asked in a hurt voice, Aren't you glad I'm not like you? Very glad. Then show it, please.
They heard the technicians and the apparatus leave the ward. Only a few doctors were busy behind the screens when a nurse came to Rima and Lanark with an armful of clothes and a couple of fat rucksacks and said, Dr. Munro wants you to dress now. He says the rucksacks are full of food for your journey and you can start eating it when you like. Rima seized the female garments and stroked them with her fingertips. They were blonde and velvety. A small, excited smile curved her lips. She sprang naked from bed, saying, I'll dress in the bathroom. She ran to the door at the end of the ward and Lanark examined the rucksacks. Each contained a rolled-up leather overcoat and hard little blocks of compressed fruit and meat wrapped in rice paper. One held a red thermos flask of coffee and a flat steel flask of brandy. The other, a first aid kit and an electric torch. Departure from this far too warm, too insulated place seemed disturbingly near. Lanark got up and carried his clothes to the bathroom.
Rima stood before a mirror, brushing her hair downward over her shoulder with slow, even strokes. She wore a short, amber-coloured long-sleeved dress and sandals of yellow leather, and Lanark stood half-hypnotized by her cool, golden, elegant figure. She murmured, Well? He said, Not bad, and started washing at a basin. Why do you say I'm beautiful? When I do, you disparage me. Yes, but I feel lonely when you don't. All right, you're beautiful. He dried himself and began putting on a grey tweed suit and pullover. She tied her hair carefully with a dark yellow ribbon, looking sad and thoughtful. He kissed her and said, Cheer up! You're the light and I'm the shadow. Aren't you glad we're different? She pulled a face and went out, saying, It's hard to shine without encouragement.
Then just let me read what Joe Ambrose said in the Irish Sunday Tribune. There is a respectable school of thought which believes that the best thing to do with writers like Alasdair Gray is to ignore them and hope they'll go away. Well, they won't go away, and they take encouragement from the silence of their critics. Gray has been compared with MacDiarmid, but on closer inspection bears a closer resemblance to the other Scottish buffoon, Compton Mackenzie. Those who have seen him on television will know the kind of chap he is. A vainglorious lout, the sort of writer who continually practices his speech for the Nobel Prize in front of the mirror, and is such a profoundly reactionary penman that he may well get to deliver it. I hope he's right. Well, I take it from the beginning again. But perhaps we've done enough.
We disturb your evening's idling with some breaking news just in. These erratum slips have been inserted by mistake.
Alasdair Gray was one of the kindest, most generous human souls I have ever met. He was also a creative genius with both brush and pen. with word and line. He was also the most non-judgmental of men. The only thing that made him angry was bad or inhuman institutions. He considered everybody worth meeting, and having met them, he considered them worth knowing. He would meet some artist or writer for the first time, and by the time they were ready to part, he would suggest that they do a shared exhibition or write a book together. He never talked about anyone, never bad-mouthed anyone. Everybody was equal and worthy of the utmost attention. We were discussing what was the best book about painting that we knew, and I was saying that I had just finished The Horse's Mouth by Joyce Carey, and Alasdair said, yes, oh, I think it's great, it's wonderful. And he began to quote from it, and I said, I envy you your recall. He was quoting things like lemon yellows and slate greys and all the rest of it. And he kind of went shy when I praised him so much. And then he tried to give me an excuse for having read so carefully. And he said, he said, the reason I recall that so well was because I was only 15 years of age when I read it. And, that was like 60 years ago. There are stories that I would like to tell about it, but we don't have the time. I remember coming up today, it was -7. It started -7 this morning, and the pavements are covered in ice and snow. And I remember about 5-6 years ago walking down Bars Road, and the conditions were very much like that. And I met Morag and Alasdair. Morag is Alasdair's wife, or was Alasdair's wife. And they were coming down the road to go to Tennant's Bar. And Alasdair had a rolled up oriental rug beneath his arm. And I said, Alasdair, what's this for? He says, oh, it's to help Morag over the more difficult bits. So I'll just leave you with that thought.
I'm sitting here in Glasgow a bit more than a year after Alasdair's death, something which I find very hard to believe, as I didn't even go to any funeral, none of us did. I know that all the friends that are still around who experienced like I did and Jim Kelman did, really, really appreciated his generosity and his absolute help by helping us all with the very different kinds of things we were all doing at that time. I want to read just a wee poem of Alasdair's that I particularly like, and I recognise the room in this poem because it's just a few streets away from me, round in Turnberry Street, which is where Alasdair lived when I first knew him, at the time that he had parted from his first wife, Inga, who I didn't know, but who is described in this poem. The poem I didn't read till the mid-80s, but it's a poem I love. Just a very short poem of Alasdair's. The poem is called Not Striving. By waiting, not striving, I found the room I wanted. It was a gift like life, not bought but rented from friends made at a stranger's party. The landlord helped build the long, low shelves. It was cheerful labour. The carpet came from my aunt, the bay window from a dead architect, and frames a chestnut tree planted by a neighbour. But I fear cheerless labour lies behind every gift. It is sore getting babies out. Who built this room were badly paid. Even gifted carpets had a weaver. By waiting, not striving, I met the woman I wanted. She stayed a while like air when breathing is easy. Worst strife was to keep those who liked me least and kept strife only. My tight grip hurted them and myself, and we parted badly. This woman moved on like the air, she unhurt and I undaunted. But I fear hard breathing is part of every climb, that the easy grip is cool, the sore grip warm, that bad partings mean more than kind leavings, and love cannot last without doing and suffering harm.
Well, it's smashing to be standing here in Òran Mór, especially in this particular spot, because in this spot, originally the Play Pine a Pint, which happens in the basement here, used to happen over here down the stage at the back here. And in one production, Alasdair was actually painting this section while the play was on. And it was a play set in Nazi Germany at the time, and it was an SS officer questioning a Jew. And at a very dramatic pause, there's this statement and kind of just could hear a pin drop. It was so quiet. And there was a clatter of just paint pots and scaffolding and everything came crashing down and everybody just stopped and what? And the actor kind of held the moment, sort of like, oh my God, waiting to when he come back in his cue. And all that pierced the air in the silence was this wee voice went, sorry? And it was poor Alasdair who just came down the scaffold and was lying on his back like a wee turtle up here. So it's lovely to be standing here for so many reasons. Tonight.
So what was that story you were telling me last night about Lanark?
Yeah, I was just trying to think about the influence of Alasdair and all the imagery in Lanark and so much there, but actually the fundamental sort of thing that I've got to thank Alasdair for is going way back to Lanark was just published. I was in 6th year at Loudon Academy in a class of 2 doing 6-year studies English and trying to figure out what to do afterwards, art school, go to university to do English because they were the only 2 things that I was any good at, and wasn't getting much advice really at home that I felt I could sort of rely on. So started talking to my English teacher about it, Mr. Bain, and he said to me, look, if you love English, if you want to have a career thinking about, the imaginary life of writing, then Alasdair Gray, Liz Lochhead, 2 of Scotland's most amazing writers right now, they both went to art school, and he started telling me about Lanark and it just lodged in my imagination, and that's what I did. So that's a pretty fundamental thing to be grateful for.
Yeah, definitely. No, I remember with Lanark when you're holding it in your hand, it's over there, but holding it in your hand, I really enjoyed that feeling that it didn't feel like other books where you were reading a book and it was a kind of version of some thoughts that somebody had in their head and then you're reading the words that described something that was happening somewhere else. But with Lanark particularly, I remember holding that in your hand, and with all the pictures and all the things that were going on and the index of plagiarisms and all that stuff, you actually felt that the thing you were holding was the thing. It wasn't like some words that referred to something somewhere else. Not ersatz, kind of something. It was the actual thing. It was an artwork. It was words, and it was drawings, and that this thing was completely more than the sum of its parts, and made this other thing, which then just made you feel that you didn't have to just do one thing.
That's so key. And I mean, I don't know what, going back to basics again, when you started thinking what art could be, but to think that it could be writing, it could be text, it
could be
all
music,
of these
could
things.
be all these things.
It could be everything together. That was really, as you say, it was coming from right inside you, rather than that it was broken down into these disciplines. That I guess was going back to my problem in the first place, like how could you sort of make these decisions based on these categories?
And I think when Lanark came out just a couple of years before we started art school, it really helped because it was part of a kind of conversation that gave you permission to be able to do all these things. You could read that and think, that you can do all that. It doesn't just have to be one text and then go and see some art somewhere else, and it could all be together in one thing.
Cut.
Hi, I'm Eugene Kelly, and this song's called Older, Faster. Getting older faster now. Do you really need to know? And the days fly past me now. Do you really need to know? My dear friend, have a wonderful life, and time may it be good to you. My dear friend, have a wonderful life, and time may be good to you. Well, love has lost me now. You really need to know. And days fly past me now. You really need to know. My dear friend, have a wonderful life, and time may be good to you. My dear friend, have a wonderful life, may the road rise along for you. If I should fall far behind, I will call. And if I should fall far behind, I will call.
Old moments. Old moments. Some moments stay as fresh and clear as this morning or 5 minutes ago, though crowds of later, mostly forgotten events have killed or changed people I used to know. In 1961, and the month we wed, I pleased a room full of folks so much that I'm proud of you, my young wife said. Our son liked to walk, holding my hand, for years before he was 10. If another boy came in sight, we parted, walked like strangers until, round a corner, he thought it right for us to join hands again. My marriage ended soon after. My son dislikes me now. Is he real stranger? Queer how, near my own end, such old moments stay so uselessly fresh and clear. Sunk ships do not dream of wreck, storms and battles that sank them. Their hulls recall waking to din of final rivets hammering in. A glide down a slipway, and how their bow first bit into brine that buoyed them up and out to sea, brine dissolving them now.
This is the last page of a long essay on Alasdair Gray that I wrote 20 years ago to celebrate his work. It begins in 1982 when I first got a copy of Lanark, this particular copy of Lanark sitting right here, and it ends with a little story, an optimistic, futuristic epilogue. A boy and his mother enter a tenement in the city's West End, situated on the top of a hill, which has been converted on all floors into a museum and a gallery. Great murals and drawings and paintings and sketches hang on each of the walls. Manuscripts and extravagant book designs are scattered around in glass display cases. In the dark subterranean basement of the converted tenement, half-spoken sentences hang in the air, and low guttural voices growl from behind panels on the floor and on the ceiling. In the lower of the building's 2 cafes, people argue passionately, but without rancour, and scraps of food are left on mouldy plates. No one is quite sure whether they should be cleaned away or not. Wrought iron staircases take the mother and her son through many different levels where they stop and stare at the exhibits too numerous to be described here. Artists and academics wander around on balconies, muttering to themselves as children scribble in notebooks and splash bright primary colours onto provided sheets of canvas. A tall man with a clipped moustache and a poker straight back takes visitors on tours and chats to them about the old days. On the roof garden, there are many fantastic plants and exotic birds and monstrous carvings and intricately constructed models that create a mosaic of ever-shifting shapes and colours when they are bathed in the bright Scottish sunshine. Occasionally, lovers emerge from the shadows to kiss and hold hands and gaze out over one of the most inspiring panoramic views imaginable. In the middle of the roof garden, there is a life-size bronze statue of a short man who stands in a manner that suggests he means business, except that his shoulders are hunched forwards and his arms hang stiffly by his sides. His stomach paunch rests majestically over the top of his belt trousers, and a corner of his shirt hangs out over his right trouser pocket. His hair is dishevelled, and a pair of square spectacles are balanced at a squint of an angle over his nose. His beady metal eyes are an explosion of wonder and incredulity as they peer out over the top of his thick spectacle frames. The statue has no pedestal and no words inscribed on it. "Is that him?" asks the wee boy. "Aye, that's him, son," says his mother. The small boy looks into the statue's comical face and sticks his tongue out. The mother pulls him along. On their way out of the converted tenement, clutching handfuls of free souvenirs, they see above the door an entrance sign that has a single neon-lit word emblazoned on it, the first two letters of which, a U and an N, have been deliberately removed, leaving a faint but clearly discernible shadow. The word above the door now says, quite simply, thanks.